Welcome to my 3D printing corner. This is going to be hopefully a series of videos where I explain 3D printing and get into some of the topics around 3D printing, so hopefully you'll be better informed about it and can make some better decisions about if you want to get into 3D printing. First off, I'm going to talk about kind of what 3D printing is, which is basically about making 3D objects into reality. So you can think of that as simply taking a 3D file, a 3D model. So you can imagine Iron Man, for example. You can imagine a 3D file, a 3D model of Iron Man, plugging that into a computer and then plugging that into some kind of a printer which makes a physical representation of that. How does that happen? Well, the printer will have a bed, some flat surface that it prints on, and then it will have a little nozzle. Here's a little nozzle here. Actually, the nozzle will have a tip. This is a pretty reasonable example of a 3D printing nozzle tip. And that will be at the end of a chamber. And you'll have filament, plastic filament, that loads into there. Basically a long line, think of like a fishing line, but much thicker, that feeds into this chamber. And then it's pushed in through a gear mechanism. And this chamber is heated up very, very, very hot. Hot enough to melt the plastic. So the gear pushes the line in. It gets very hot in here and melts liquid enough that it squirts out the nozzle tip here. So you imagine you got plastic gooping out and getting pushed out of this tip. And then you have this build plate, and which the nozzle can go down to and draw essentially the plastic onto this build surface. Let's further imagine that 3D file has been decomposed into different layers. So let's say you wanted to print this rock monster as an example. I painted it up a little bit, but here's a little rock monster. How would you print this? Well, an easy way to do it would be if the software went to the very bottom of the rock monster and essentially created a two-dimensional image of the bottom of that layer and came up with a series of commands that would tell this nozzle to go down to one corner of this and start squirting out plastic in that shape of that lower layer, right? So that bottom layer gets plastic squirted out in that shape, and then the nozzle would move up a little bit and squirt plastic in the shape of the next highest layer, or the second most bottom layer, if you will, going all the way up the entire shape. So you start at the bottom, squirt out plastic in that shape, move up a little bit, squirt out plastic in a slightly different shape, move all the way up until the entire thing is printed, right? So essentially, if you imagine this here, that shape there is the first layer, right? That's the shape that gets squirted out by the plastic, or by the nozzle as plastic, as heated up plastic. And then the nozzle can move up a little bit, squirt out some more plastic, and eventually build up that shape in whatever plastic you have. Now, 3D printers can work with different kinds of materials, not just standard plastic, but plastic's an easy, convenient material to print in. PLA is the most common one right now. And so sometimes you'll see stuff people have 3D printed. Here's a 3D printed dragon, pretty darn cool. How do you 3D print something like this? By printing it in segments. So each of these wings is a separate piece. The head is a separate piece. The tail is a separate piece. In fact, you can probably see the seam right there, maybe just barely on the, yeah, it's right there, on the tail. And then you glue all those pieces together and paint them. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces, I think. Yeah, all glued together and then painted. So that is one way of doing it, right? This guy's wing is actually a little bit loose. So you can get a lot of detail on one of these things just with something like that by printing out in a bunch of different pieces. Similarly, with some of these large 3D printed objects, this is a multi-stage print. So you can just barely see there on her torso. There's a seam there, and then there's a more obvious seam up here in the middle of the torso. See if we can get it to focus in on that. Right, so you get this idea that you print basically this part, and then these parts, and then the bottom. This is Ultima Futura Automaton from Metropolis, the classic 1920s film, inspiration for C-3PO. And that's the other thing you can do is you print in multiple pieces and then glue them together. So there's also post-processing. That's an important thing about 3D printing is that a lot of people think that 3D printing is a matter of putting your final object into the 3D printer in terms of a software file. That final thing is going into the 3D printer, and then what you pop off of the plate is the final object. Nothing else gets done. That's actually very rare. There's usually a lot of other steps that are involved. So, for example, what if you're printing something that has a very complex shape? You can't print, let's say I wanted to print this shape, but for some strange reason, I printed it like this, right, on the build plate. It would then go and it would print that bottom layer. That's not a problem, right? And it would go up. But what happens when it gets to the higher layers up here in the piece? You're going to have an issue because basically that's going to goop, right? Because the nozzle is going to be much higher on the build plate, and it's not going to have anything on which to stick this layer, right? So you can't have these really weird complex shapes without something to support those higher surfaces. So for example, this is a little throne made of skulls that I printed recently. And you can see it doesn't look exactly like a bunch of skulls because the software added a bunch of support structures onto this. A bunch of little ridges that rise up all around the throne to support all of the overhanging skulls on the throne, right? So you see these pieces here, and if I can just go ahead and tear off some of those support materials, and you're starting to see now the internals of that throne just by tearing off that support structure. And you learn to be careful with this, but you see now you can see the side of that throne and all the skulls on there. And so you basically go all the way around to all the different spots that have support on them, pulling off that support. And there are a variety of different tools you can use for this. Some more careful than others. This is a fairly coarse tool, but for this initial pass at removing the support materials, it usually is appropriate. There we go. And so with a few more pulls, I'll have a lot of these off. And I can go back with a more careful tool, basically tweezers. And you can see now the back of that with all of its skulls. Very nice. All the way around there. So obviously there's some more support materials to pull off, but that's the kind of post-processing you'll often have to do with your 3D prints to get them to look the way you want to. Okay, so kind of in review, a 3D printer is basically just a machine that has a flat surface and a nozzle and plastic. And the plastic is squirted out from the nozzle onto the build plate in shapes, in essentially flat shapes that are layered up to form a three-dimensional shape, a three-dimensional object. Pardon. So part of the idea of 3D printing is to find shapes that are easily printable. Some things that are very delicate and have a lot of complex geometry on them are a lot harder to print, and you won't see those 3D printed nearly as often. But that's kind of the idea of how that goes. Asked in the chat room, what is the lifespan of the plastic? It's plastic. This is actually a PLA, which is actually a cornstarch-based plastic. It's not quite as durable as the kind of plastic you'd get on an action figure that you'd buy at a toy store. So it's not going to last for, decades and decades and decades. But it will certainly last for years. It's a little bit more, it doesn't have quite the same tensile strength. So, a kid can mangle and fiddle with plastic, and it will resist damage better than PLA will. But we're assuming that PLA is being used by adults, and adults giving things to kids and telling them this is a little more fragile than the average plastic piece. Also, this gets to an important point I'll talk about in a later video. You will not necessarily print everything in solid PLA. Usually you will tell the software to fill in the inside of your shape with a webbing, essentially, of plastic that gives it some internal structure, but not a lot. Why waste all the plastic that would fill this up, because you have to buy it, which is not expensive, but still. It also slows down your build time, having a lot of plastic in there. So, all of these models are more or less hollow. They have about 20% plastic infill, so a network of plastic struts essentially inside. So all the which makes them nice and light, which is rather nice. So there's that, where they're fragile in that sense because it's not injection molded plastic, which is solid plastic. But yeah, I certainly have 3D printed objects around here that have lasted for years. So, it's plastic. It'll last for quite a while. All right, so that's the introduction. I'll be doing more videos on this. Just wanted to kind of get down how the basics of it work. In later videos, we'll talk about what to look for in a 3D printer, what to look for in your files, common file formats, how to model stuff, how to find files to print, all that kind of stuff. But hopefully this will kind of get you started.